The Muggle Death Eater and His Daughter by Great 78. Chapter 7. Doubts and Disappearances. A Wednesday in October 1993. Seeing as Richard Granger was a dead end for answers, and Sirius Black was still missing, Lucius decided that the next best thing was to try Remus Lupin. As a member of the Board of Governors of Hogwarts School, Lucius was welcome at the school any time he wished to visit. Therefore, in the middle of October, he stopped in to chat.
"Ah, Mr. Malfoy, please, come in. Take a seat if you'd like. Would you care for tea?"
The shabbily dressed professor was seated at his desk, a stack of essays waiting to be graded in front of him.
"Thank you for seeing me, Professor."
Lucius struggled to keep the note of condescension out of his voice. It was difficult. The man really was dressed, only a little better than a street urchin.
"I suppose you're here about Draco's work in class?"
Lucius had not been, but if Lupin thought he was, perhaps he should have been.
Yes. Is there any reason for concern?"
"No, quite the opposite. Draco is leading his house in class mocks. He's doing remarkably well. Clearly he's spending time practicing on his own, which is splendid."
"That's good. I'm glad to hear he's taking an interest in his subjects."
"Yes."
Lupin looked at him expectantly, waiting for more.
"Well, as you perhaps know, my son has become friendly with Hermione Granger."
"Yes, I must say it's pleasant to see a friendship between a Muggle-born and a pure-blood."
Lucius could detect the unspoken insult. Spoiled rich boy. Bigot. Within Lupin's words.
"Quite," Lucius replied, tight-lipped. "I've been in contact with her father."
He waited to see if this resonated at all with the other wizard. It did not appear to, although this did not surprise Lucius. If Lupin was in fact a secret agent, one simple sentence would not be enough for him to divulge his mission to a potential enemy or ally.
"Yes?"
Lupin asked, furrowing his brow in what Lucius had to assume was a pretense of confusion.
"Though he is Muggle, he seems to be a man of, let us say, many talents."
Lupin looked down at his desk as though distracted by something there. Then he looked back up, a hard gleam in his eye.
"I have no doubt that the man is quite talented, if his daughter's marks are anything to go by."
Lucius leaned forward, interested. He assumed Hermione must be rather intelligent, as well endowed genetically as she possibly was.
"Really? I was wondering if you could tell me. How is she faring in classes?"
"Quite well. In fact, she has nearly the top score in the class. Why? Are you worried that she's a distraction for your son?"
Lupin raised one eyebrow.
"Surely it's too early to think about pure-blood marriage traditions, Mr. Malfoy. I don't think at 13 years old he will be corrupted by her, if that's what you're afraid of."
"It wasn't,"
Lucius said quickly, although now that it had been mentioned, it kind of was. He knew the children were friends, but did Draco like this girl in that way? This posed all kinds of new worries for him. Her suitability as a Muggle-born aside, what was her actual birth parentage? Her bloodline? The Malfoys and Blacks were members of the Sacred 28. To taint their lineage with unknown, outside blood. Lucius shuddered to think of it. There was one other professor within the school that might be able to offer some insight, although Lucius was reluctant to seek out his counsel because he had no idea what the man would do with the information Lucius had about Richard Granger. But he resolved to keep the specifics to himself. The dungeons were as cold as ever. Lucius found his old schoolmate there, making tedious notes over a cauldron, as always. Severus Snape at one time had been one of the Dark Lord's closest allies. Since the fall of Voldemort, however, he had been one of the most outspoken against him. This meant that Lucius had no idea where he stood now. Whilst it was entirely possible that Snape still worked secretly on behalf of the Dark Wizard, he seemed entirely smitten with the idea of whiling away his years as the lapdog of Albus Dumbledore.
"Ah, Snape, good to see you."
"Lucius."
Neither wizard spoke for a moment. Lucius decided to forge ahead as though they were still on the same side. That is to say, the side of Dumbledore and his order.
"I suppose you have been reading the papers. This business with Sirius Black."
"I have," Snape said succinctly.
"Well, what do you make of it?"
Snape gazed at him openly, as though looking for elaboration. Finding none, he sighed.
"I believe Sirius Black plans to find the Dark Lord and become his servant once more."
"Yes, that's my belief as well," Lucius said.
"And do you find the appointment of Professor Lupin to be oddly coincidental in that regard?"
"I do," Snape drawled.
Lucius nodded. "Yes. Yes, building an army again." "Indeed."
Snape raised a brow at him.
"Snape, if I may speak frankly, old friend to old friend."
"Of course."
"I believe outside forces are at work here."
"Outside forces?"
"Yes, outside of the wizarding world."
Lucius feared saying more. If Snape was on the side of Dumbledore, he did not wish to alert the headmaster to the presence of a Muggle danger. Best to let Granger try and take on Dumbledore himself. If it came to that, Granger could use the element of surprise against the old man.
"Indeed." "Yes, I'll say no more."
Lucius turned to go, and then, almost as an afterthought, turned back.
"By the way, how is Draco faring so far this year?"
"Draco is doing as well as always, earning mostly E's with a handful of A's and O's on his assignments."
"That's excellent to hear. I was wondering, have you seen him interacting with Miss Granger?"
"I have," said Snape, unhelpful as always.
"And?"
When the professor did not elaborate, Lucius huffed.
"I mean to say, do you feel she is a menace to him?"
Snape fixed him with a hard stare, but after a moment spoke.
"Miss Granger is by far one of the most intelligent students I've ever had the misfortune of teaching. She not only knows the current lesson, forwards and backwards, but the next one, and the one after that, and the one for next week. And from inane discussions that take place in the faculty lounge, it is the same in every class. Believe me when I say, Lucius, Hermione Granger is a menace to everyone."
Snape had rattled him, to be sure. It was nearing the lunch hour. Lucius decided it was best to find his son and have a sit-down with him. Back in the upstairs corridors, he saw Draco at a distance, exiting the arithmancy classroom with Theo Knott and a Ravenclaw boy. As he watched, Hermione Granger exited the room behind them. The group approached, but when they arrived at his side, Miss Granger was no longer to be seen in the corridor.
"Draco, I was hoping that I might have lunch with you and perhaps Hermione Granger,"
he said, peering about for her.
"Yes, Father, that would be excellent. Let me just—"
Draco turned around, also searching the throngs of students milling about on their way down to the Great Hall. "That's odd. I sit in the back of the classroom, and she sits in the front. She usually walks out behind me." "Yes, she was just there. I saw her,"
Lucius said with a note of concern in his voice. Where could the girl have gone?
"Oh well," Draco replied. "Perhaps she had to stop by her common room or something." Draco turned to a boy hurrying away. "Miles, if you see Hermione, can you ask her to meet us? Would you like to eat in the private chamber off the Great Hall, Father?"
The four of them, Lucius and the three boys, took the staircase down.
"Yes, I think that's best."
When they arrived in the Great Hall, Lucius was gobsmacked to find Hermione Granger nearly done with her lunch at the Gryffindor table. They approached as she stood to go. "Oh, Mr. Malfoy, how lovely to see you! I didn't expect you to be here today. Draco, did you know your father was coming? You could have told me." The witch smiled up at his son. Draco smiled back at her, and the leaden bludger in the pit of Lucius's stomach dropped lower.
"Miss Granger, I was hoping you could join Draco and me for lunch, but it appears you are done."
Yes. I had to hurry. I still need to go to the library and find a book for care of magical creatures."
Draco laughed. "Are you already starting on your hippogriff essay, Granger? You know it isn't due for 2 weeks."
"Well, Draco, you know what they say. The early bird gets the worm," Hermione answered. She gave a knowing smirk, and her eyes sparkled gleefully, almost threateningly, as she met the gaze of first Draco and then Lucius. Were they the worms? Lucius thought irrationally.
"Don't mention worms in your essay, Granger. Hagrid will have us studying those next,"
Draco was saying. Lucius worked to keep a sneer of distaste from his face.
"There was a professor that he would not be visiting today, if he could help it. Well, let us not keep you. Have a delightful afternoon."
Father and son watched her go with vastly different expressions on their faces. She had been upstairs, behind Draco, he thought. Lucius knew there was no exit leading to the Great Hall from the other end of that corridor, not without taking about a dozen winding staircases and a couple of secret passageways, typically known only to upperclassmen. And yet, somehow, she had not only gotten to the Great Hall before them, but had finished her entire meal in the time that it took them to walk down 2 flights of stairs. Something wasn't adding up. Was it possible that this witch, this extraordinary girl, a 3rd year, had somehow managed to learn to apparate within the grounds of Hogwarts? Even the headmaster wasn't allowed to break those magical bonds, and yet somehow she had bent the laws of space and time around her. Coming here had dredged up more questions than it answered. What kind of magical being were they dealing with here?
"Miney, have you seen my rat, Scabbers? He's been moping around the common room lately and I can't find him."
Ronald Weasley folded his tall, gangly body to the ground, lifting the skirt of a bottom of a squashy armchair and peering underneath it, poking his lit wand at all the crevices and cracks. "Sorry, Ron, I haven't. Perhaps you ought to consider a cage for him," Hermione suggested as nicely as she could. She and Ron had reached something of a truce over the last couple of years after their rocky start in 1st year. Though she wouldn't classify him amongst her closest friends, Hermione had struck up a friendship with his sister, Ginny. Additionally, he was close friends with Harry Potter, and she and Harry had bonded during their time at Hogwarts. As 2 of the only 3 Gryffindors in their year raised by Muggles, she and Harry, and occasionally Dean, often found themselves giggling over wizard eccentricities, or comparing notes in their studies. Harry was quite smart, she found, and whilst Ron might not rival him in academics, Hermione had to admit that the ginger-haired wizard was a loyal friend to the boy with the unusual scar. Hermione, of course, had read all there was to read about the subject of Harry Potter and Voldemort.
She knew, too, that he was rather unnerved about the whole Sirius Black escape. Sometimes, late at night, he would creep down to the common room and find her scratching her quill across parchment, recopying her own notes or penning an essay. They would talk then, openly and honestly, in a way that he likely could not do with Ron. I just can't figure it out. He's always been a good rat. Kept his fur neat, ate a good meal. I've had him for several years, and Percy had him before then. But here lately he's been looking rather manky. I tried rat tonic, but it did nothing for him. Now I hadn't seen him for at least a week.
Hermione hesitated to offer her thoughts on the matter. Ron clearly had difficulty with letting things go, and she knew from talking with Ginny that their family likely didn't have the funds to buy Ron a new pet. She had learned that much when Ginny had detailed the story of how she'd acquired an unusual diary at a thrift shop. That diary had led to the opening of the Chamber of Secrets, releasing the basilisk the year before. It was that very story, in fact, that had finally swayed her opinion of Ron Weasley. Anyone that followed their best friend into a sewer in order to save his little sister couldn't be all bad, she thought charitably. But this rat, Scabbers, if Ron truly had the animal for years, as he said, more than likely it had just holed away, looking for a place to die.
Tell you what, I'll check the girls' dormitories, okay?
Hermione closed her book and climbed the dormitory steps to her room. She flipped up the valence sheet on each bed, finding no rats, of course, but at least she could truthfully tell Ron that she had looked.
Merlin's tits! He felt like he was going in circles. Scratch that. He was going in circles. He had finally managed to escape the boys' dormitory in Gryffindor Tower about 2 weeks ago, when someone left the door ajar. It had taken him 3 days to find his way through the castle to an exit. It was by sheer luck that he happened to find the humpback, one-eyed witch statue, recognizing it as a passage to Honeydukes down in the village of Hogsmeade. Now he was headed south, he thought. Being in the possession of neither money nor wand, Peter Pettigrew was relying upon his wits and his sense of direction to find his way to his former master's house. Unfortunately for him, Peter had always had a scarcity of both, and that was why, for the past 10 days or so, he'd been wandering in circles in the Scottish countryside. Winter was nearly here. Soon he would need to find a hole, bury himself deep, and scavenge a few months' supply of food, so that he could hunker down for winter. He shivered a bit, despite his fur coat, which was indeed looking rather manky. He only wished that he could have stayed put, could have stayed the boy's rat forever. That had been his intention, initially, once it became obvious that the Dark Lord likely wasn't coming back. He had managed to fool the entire wizarding world, so it had been fairly easy to fool a single family. Was it a bit odd, sleeping in a boy's pocket for several hours a day? Sharing that boy's body heat in bed at night? Yes, all right, he would admit it. It was odd. But he was a rat, after all. Sometimes, as a rat, you had to put up with, let's call it, sticky situations. A 13-year-old boy's bed was meant to be a solitary place. It was just an unfortunate turn of events that Peter found himself there. He shuddered. At least there would be no more repeats of those incidents. A large snowflake fell to the ground next to him, nearly the size of his own rat head. Peter sighed inwardly. It was time. He hurried on. This late in the autumn, bugs might be difficult to find, but perhaps he could still find some seeds. It would have to do. For the next day or so, Peter worked on digging a hole as deeply as his 9 little rat fingers could dig. Then he worked in a radial pattern around the hole, gathering as many stores of food as he could. It was December 10th, 1993.
It was going to be a long winter. Chapter 8. Meetings and Meals. A Thursday, in early April 1994. It was only the Easter holiday in her 3rd year, and already Hermione was greatly looking forward to the summer break. She had tried to take on too much. She saw that now. The time turner, whilst useful for allowing her extra time for homework, classes, and occasionally a little extra sleep, had become an albatross around her neck. She felt that she'd aged nearly 2 years in the span of the last 7 months. There were light footsteps on the boys' staircase. The shadow of Harry's unkempt hair was thrown into relief on the stone wall behind him, his wand casting a low lumos. "Hermione, I thought that might be you. More revision?"
"Always, Harry. What has you awake at this hour?"
Something happened earlier. I went down earlier to visit with Hagrid at his hut. Ron was in detention and couldn't go with me, so I was by myself, and it was dark."
Hermione was exasperated. Had this wizard learned nothing from his previous encounters with the Dementors? "Harry, you know you're not supposed to be out by yourself after dark. The Dementors are patrolling just outside the gates. After what happened on the train and at the Quidditch match against Hufflepuff."
"The Dementors are staying away, at least for now. But I did have an odd encounter out in the grounds, and I'm not sure what to make of it."
Hermione looked at him with concern. "What happened? Who did you meet?"
"Sirius Black."
It was too fantastical, almost, to believe. Sirius Black, it seemed, was quite possibly innocent. He and Harry's parents had all been double-crossed by another friend of theirs, Peter Pettigrew. This news would have been bad enough, but then Harry dropped an even weirder bombshell. Pettigrew had escaped punishment after framing Sirius for his and their murders all those years ago, and had apparently been masquerading as Percy and Ron's pet rat for over 12 years. She and Harry could not tell Ron about any of this, that much was clear. The idea that the boy had doted upon and cared for the rat was sad enough, but that he had essentially been sharing a bed with a fully grown man was cringeworthy at the very least, even if one were to ignore the criminality of it all. Despite the strangeness of the tale, the story had been corroborated by Professor Lupin, whom Hermione trusted implicitly. He had seen the two of them, Harry and Sirius, on the grounds that evening on a magical map that he'd confiscated from Harry weeks before. Lupin had gone to confront Black, to take him into custody and turn over to the authorities. Instead, Black had explained everything. How he had recognized Ron's rat as Pettigrew from an article in the Daily Prophet, how he had escaped as an animagus from Azkaban, how he was coming back to protect Harry and capture Peter. Lupin had summoned the Prophet article from Harry's dormitory, and the photograph from it, plus Harry's description of Scabbers, had confirmed it for Lupin. Sirius had given Harry a photo album that he carried with him for the past 12 years, since he'd been arrested. The photos showed a happier time in the lives of Sirius and of Harry and his parents. Hermione's heart broke for the boy as he showed her picture after picture of the happy young family and their friends. Without Peter to corroborate the story, there was no evidence that Black was innocent, but Hermione could tell that he was truly innocent in Harry's eyes.
"He'll stay in London. His ancestral home is unplottable, so he'll be safe, and I might be able to go visit at summers."
"That's lovely, Harry. I'm so happy to hear it." Hermione knew that, above all, Harry wished for a real family. It might be 13 years late, but his godfather was here, now. Weeks later, Harry shared a letter that he'd received from Sirius. Using his animagus form, he was trying to suss out where Peter Pettigrew might have disappeared to. Harry and Professor Lupin spoke to Professor Dumbledore,
and explained the situation at length. Dumbledore had been in touch with Sirius, and according to Harry, they had discussed their concerns with him about Voldemort regaining a loyal servant in the form of Peter, who might seek him out. At the end of the school year, Remus Lupin was making plans to move in with Sirius, so that they could work together on the Peter problem. All of them thought the worst, fearing that Peter might have gone to find his old master and restore him to life. And find his old master Peter eventually would, though he wasn't looking for him. Peter only intended to make his way to the old Riddle House. In the last years of Voldemort's reign of terror, late in the 1970s, they had used the house as a hideout. To Peter's knowledge, Voldemort had gone to great lengths to get the deed to the house put in his own name somehow, whether through Confundus charms or imperious curses on Muggles. By using a handful of harmless spells and transfigurations, Voldemort had rendered the house creepy in the eyes of the townspeople of Little Hangleton, so that, for the most part, they left it quite alone. Any overly brave or overly stupid teenagers who took the challenge of trying to break in didn't try it a second time. The old Muggle caretaker, oblivious, as always, to the house's inhabitants, continued to care for the gardens and the exterior, leaving the inside to crumble and rot, or so he thought. In actuality, Voldemort had created a sumptuous wizarding oasis inside. Lush velvet curtains hung at the windows, rich brocade-covered chaises stretching unused along the walls. In truth, Voldemort had only cleaned and revitalized what was once his grandparents' possessions, but to his followers that visited there during the height of his power, he gave the impression that it was all acquired by him, by his own pure-blood riches. None of that particularly mattered to Pettigrew, however. All he knew was that somewhere in northern England, in a tiny village called Little Hangleton, a sprawling, dilapidated manor house awaited him, and in the downstairs study, inside a desk, locked inside of a wooden box with a simple runic combination lock, was a collection of spare wands. One of them was yew and phoenix feather. Peter didn't want that one. He had removed that one himself from the little house in Godric's Hollow mere minutes after Voldemort had gotten himself blasted apart by baby Harry Potter. Peter would forever associate that wand with creeping back down the stairs, holding it out in front of him as though it were a Muggle bomb, carefully avoiding the crying black-haired baby and the dead gazes of Lily Potter and his old friend James. No, that one could stay inside the box forever, as far as Peter was concerned. His own wand wasn't there. It had been lost in the detritus of the destroyed house in Godric's Hollow. But any of the other wands, any of them would be heaven-sent right now. With a wand he could disapparate. He could enter a Muggle grocery in the dead of night and take whatever he'd like. He could imperious a restaurant owner into creating the most fanciful, succulent dishes imaginable. Peter was quite hungry. Guarding his strength, he pushed weakly through the barrier of leaves and loam, bracing himself for the chill that he expected above ground. He had to go to the surface to scavenge something more to eat. His storage was empty. There was nothing left. Last night, he'd eaten a bit of dirt in the hopes of dampening the gnawing sensation in his stomach. But when he emerged, rather than finding the bleak midwinter that he'd found many times before, he was confronted by a tuft of green grass, and above him a weak, grey sunshine. It was spring. Time to get moving again. Early July, 1994. Summer in England that year brought plenty of exciting news to the wizarding community. First, England was to play host to the finals of the Quidditch World Cup, and though their national team had lost and was knocked out of contention in an earlier round, the final match was certain to be exciting. Ireland was a solid contender, and Bulgaria would bring young phenom Victor Krum, a superstar in the sport, at the age of 18. Secondly, Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry would host a Triwizard Tournament, something that had not been attempted in many years. The first bit of news Hermione learned from the Daily Prophet, which she had delivered to her house in Hampstead. The second bit of news they learned from Lucius Malfoy, who learned it as a member of the Board of Governors. In a show of good faith, the Malfoys had agreed to come to dinner at the Grangers' house. They arrived by flu promptly at 6. Even though Draco had a slightly better understanding of the television, he knew rationally now that the people were not trapped inside. It was only sort of a unique photograph of them. He still gave it a wide berth as he stepped out of the loo.
"Lord and Lady Granger, thank you for your invitation, and for welcoming us into your home."
Lucius bowed to them, rising up to cast a slightly critical eye around the place. Whilst he knew better than to expect a proper manor home, this was not what he imagined of the home of a Muggle commander in the Dark Lord's army. Though the house was spacious, finely furnished, and well decorated, it appeared that the formal dining room was directly connected to the kitchens, rather than being separated by a floor, as it was in Malfoy Manor. As he looked about, Lucius began to wonder if it was the only dining room.
"Merlin help us all," he thought.
"Mr. and Mrs. Granger, I'm so pleased to see you again,"
Draco began, earning a stern look from Lucius. Hermione had explained to him during the school year that her parents were not, in fact, a lord and lady, at least not in the formal sense. But Lucius had impressed upon him the need to treat the Grangers with the utmost respect, due to the man's position within the Dark Lord's army, and starting off the evening by not addressing them with their titles seemed rather rude. To make up for it, Draco bent into a small bow to appease his father. "Hello, Draco. We're glad you're here," said Linda. "I hope you all brought an appetite. We ordered curry, chicken vindaloo, and mutton chechenade with naan bread." "Yes, the non-elves really outdid themselves," Richard said, rubbing his hands together in anticipation. "I can guarantee you there will be none left when we're done with it." Draco smiled weakly because he could see that Hermione found this amusing, but he had to admit it was hard to figure out when Richard Granger was joking around. He was fairly certain, for instance, that the non-elves could just make more non-bread once this was eaten. As they sat around the table, Draco brought up the World Cup and shared the news that his father had acquired tickets for all of them to attend. "Oh, how exciting! I've seen pictures in Hermione's newspaper, but it will be wonderful to see a match being played," Linda exclaimed.
"Yes, we thought your family would enjoy it,"
Lucius replied, eager to please. "I'm particularly excited to see this Krum kid play," Richard said conversationally.
"Oh?"
Lucius asked, intrigued. "Yes, he seems to be quite the rising star in the sport."
"Yes, he's had good mentors over the years."
If Lucius's suspicions were correct, Granger knew one of these mentors. Igor Kokorov was another of those who had claimed to see the error of his ways, and had spoken out against his fellow Death Eaters after Voldemort's fall. Lucius assumed that Granger knew all of this, and that's why he was eager to see Krum, thinking that it would get him close to Kokorov for retribution. "Yes, well, I hear the Irish team has all new firebolt brooms as well," Richard offered. Draco shifted in his seat uncomfortably. The firebolt's superiority had been a point of contention within their house after Draco had failed to catch the snitch in the Gryffindor versus Slytherin game at school in the past year. Draco was quick to blame the speed of the firebolt, but Lucius was annoyed. The previous year he'd spent quite a few galleons to purchase Nimbus 2000s for the Slytherin team, only for the season to be cancelled before it was finished. He'd expected Draco and the others to flatten the competition in his 3rd year, but that hadn't been the case.
"You've really been learning a lot about Quidditch and broom types, Richard,"
Narcissa said. "Yes, I've been brushing up on my knowledge." Linda only rolled her eyes at her lap. Narcissa coughed into her napkin. Draco's and Hermione's eyes met as they challenged each other not to smile. It was nearly time for the Quidditch World Cup. They were to make a long visit of it. The Grangers would come on Sunday for dinner, and would spend the night at Malfoy Manor. They would leave after an early breakfast on Monday for the Quidditch World Cup. The match would be held that evening, and they would stay the night in the Malfoy tent, returning to Hampstead Tuesday morning. Draco and Narcissa were excited for their friends to visit. Lucius was nervous, having Richard Granger around, as always. The Grangers arrived at 5 in the evening, a bit early because Narcissa wished to show Linda around the gardens. "Come on," Draco said, taking Hermione by the hand and leading her out the side door towards the lake. "I want to show you our Kelpie." Hermione immediately stopped walking, withdrawing her hand from Draco's.
"Why would I want to see a shape-shifting demon creature that drags people underwater to kill them?"
she asked incredulously. "Granger, I'm not going to feed you to it. I only want you to see it. Besides, he's quite tame. His name's Kirby, and most of the time the shape he takes on is that of a small dog." At her look of uncertainty, he stepped back to her, placing his hand upon hers reassuringly. "I've been swimming in that lake since I was 6. I'm sure he won't hurt us." Richard is excited for the match tomorrow. We've honestly never seen a flying broomstick, so it'll all be a bit overwhelming, but thrilling, I'm sure. Richard always likes to act as though he's seen everything before. I think he feels as though Lucius will judge him for being a Muggle if he doesn't. But truly, he's like a child at Christmas. Narcissa smiled. She was well aware of her own husband's desire to impress Richard, and she wasn't sure anything she said could dissuade Lucius from believing what he wanted to believe. But she also knew that it was likely that at some point Lucius would outright make a comment about Richard's supposed history as a Death Eater secret agent. When this happened, Richard would quickly disabuse him of this notion, and all of this, Narcissa's and Linda's friendship, Draco and Hermione's young romance, would be over. Narcissa decided to take a gamble, share some of the truth, but perhaps not the whole truth.
"Lucius is excited as well. He enjoys Richard's company very much. Tell me a bit about when you were younger, when the two of you met, Richard's time in the service and all of that."
"Oh, nothing very exciting, I'm afraid. We met at university, but he wasn't sure what he wanted to do, so he left and spent a few years as a young troop. He became a medic and really enjoyed it. He got out and finished his degree whilst I was in dental school. Then Richard got called back into the service for a few years. But it was stressful. Plenty of medical emergencies, I suppose. I was a few hours away, interning at a dental practice at the time. We weren't married yet. But I think the stress finally got to him, so he got out of the service again and went to dentistry school. We got married and opened our own practice, and that was that."
"Is a medic considered a healer of sorts?"
Narcissa asked. "Yes, I suppose that's the closest thing in the magical world."
The blonde witch chuckled to herself. "I think Lucius assumes that he was some sort of a special secret agent whilst in the service," she said, smiling as though this were a ridiculous notion.
"Oh my goodness, that certainly wasn't the case."
Linda laughed.
Narcissa stopped and turned to her new friend,
smiling gently. "The thing is, Lucius always wanted to be in the service himself. I think he's living a bit vicariously through your husband. He would be so disappointed knowing the truth, I think."
Linda nodded. "I understand. Everyone likes to live out a fantasy, sometimes, I suppose. Well, Lucius won't hear the truth from me." She smiled.
"Good. It will be such a fun weekend, the 6 of us. Draco is quite excited about tomorrow as well. Not just for the World Cup, but that Hermione is attending with us. He talks quite a lot about her."
"Yes, she's the same about him. I'm so glad they're friends."
The two women smiled conspiratorially at each other and continued their tour of the garden.
"Fancy a drink before dinner?"
Lucius asked cordially, gesturing to his study. It was time for some answers. Once in the study, Lucius passed over the fire whiskey. Richard's glass, after the reception years ago, had gone nearly untouched, he remembered. He poured 2 glasses of ginger gin over ice, surreptitiously tipping a clear vial over the right one, whilst Richard was distracted by the books in Lucius's bookcase.
"Ah, I see you have that new book on Transfigurations by Turnbull. Hermione's reading that one as well,"
Richard remarked.
"Yes, it's fascinating,"
Lucius said, offering him the drink in his right hand.
"Here we are. 2 strong friendships." Chapter 9. Chatter, Chattel, and Cattle. Richard turned away from the bookcase and accepted the proffered drink from Lucius.
"To strong friendships,"
Richard echoed, sipping the cool ginger gin and finding it far more palatable than fire whiskey.
"This is good. I found the fire whiskey a tad strong."
As he said it, his eyes widened slightly. He hadn't intended to say that out loud. It was assumed that as a man you liked the taste of whiskey neat. No one ever admitted to finding it too strong, and yet he just had. But Lucius seemed to ignore this.
"So, Hermione told Draco that she was adopted. Is that correct?" "Yes. Linda was unable to have children because of an illness she had as a child."
Why had he told Lucius this part? It wasn't Lucius's business, really. He had been thirsty, and had finished off half his glass in the first sip. This gin must be deceptively strong. He should be more careful. Not that Hermione's adoption was a secret, of course. They had told her that she had been adopted from a young age, and had no problems telling others. It was true, Hermione did look a bit like Richard, which led to a few confusing and sometimes funny moments over the years. But they always wanted her to know that she had been chosen, that they had wanted her especially. Richard and Linda had both longed for a large family, but it had not been in the cards for them. Still, they were over the moon to have the chance to adopt Hermione. But Linda's infertility had always been a sensitive thing for her, and Richard felt a bit ashamed for having revealed it to Lucius.
"Who are Hermione's birth parents?"
The mother was from northern England. She was married to a man in the Black Watch, but he was away on an extended mission. Her husband didn't want children. She got in the family way with another man and didn't want to keep the baby. She was afraid to tell her husband because the baby's father was his commander. We learned about her situation through an intermediary acquaintance in the service and adopted the baby." Lucius gasped and stood stock still, processing all of this information. The Black Watch. This had to be a group of Death Eaters. He could only think of 2 Blacks who, without any shadow of a doubt, had been Death Eaters, Regulus Black and Bellatrix Black Lestrange. Bellatrix had married a Lestrange soon after leaving Hogwarts, and whilst the Lestrange family was quite well off and was part of the Sacred 28, they were not completely accepted in pure-blood society. There had been controversy in their ancestral lines, and the descendants still lived with that pall hanging over their name. The Black Watch. It would make complete sense if Bellatrix's husband Rodolphus and his brother Ravestan had used Bellatrix's and her cousin's name as a way of distinguishing themselves among the Death Eaters. He needed more information. So this woman, she fell in love with their leader? Well, I don't know if you would call it love, but yeah, that seemed to be the short of it. Granted, the man was quite gregarious and engaging. I knew him a bit better. I only met her a couple of times, right before she had Hermione. I suppose you have to be convivial to be a commander, and the Black Watch is a very elite unit.
Yes, that would fit. He recalled Bellatrix often throwing herself at the Dark Lord, giving him suggestive looks, flirting with him. She was never very demure about it. She wanted the Dark Lord for her own, and had treated her marriage to Rodolphus as a mere formality, almost from the moment the ink on the marriage contract had dried.
When was Hermione born? September 19th, 1979.
The middle of September. That would put her conception date. Lucius performed quick calculations in his head. Around Christmas, 1978. He would come back to that later. The Veritaserum would only work for a short time more. Richard had already abandoned the ginger gin, and might become suspicious soon.
Tell me more about your work.
Well, we see lots of folks, about 10 or 12 a day. It's good to stay busy, always something different, mostly just cleanings or fillings. Once in a while, an avulsion or an excision.
Yes, this would be his cover story, then. Lucius knew that Richard now acted as a Muggle healer of some sort.
But occasionally, I do have to do extractions.
Extraction? That sounded far more sinister. Do you mean removal? Lucius felt a chill within him that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room.
Yes, it's a last resort, but sometimes it's necessary. When things become diseased, there's very little you can do. You don't want the rot to spread. It has to be taken out.
Lucius's breath caught in his chest. I see. And how many of these extractions have you performed?
Geez, I'd have to say probably in the hundreds.
Lucius staggered backwards, catching himself on the edge of his desk. Hundreds! This man, who gave the image of a mild-mannered Muggle, had been responsible for hundreds of deaths. Even Lucius, no stranger to murder himself, could not believe it. And is that what you did when you were in his service? His voice came out almost as a whisper.
Not at first. I was just a grunt, to begin with, patrols and the like, but I did additional training and I worked my way up. Plenty of bloody situations I found myself in, you can be sure, and there were other missions.
Indeed.
And these extractions, these begin whilst you were serving him.
This last word was nearly a whisper.
Yes, I did some of those in the service. I admit, though, I was a bit of a brute. I didn't know what I was doing then, and sometimes it was more painful than it needed to be.
And now?
Oh, I'm a bit better at it, though, to be honest, Linda's the real smooth operator when it comes to extractions.
Linda? She had always seemed so mild-mannered. Could she be an assassin?
Yes, indeed. Well, it only makes sense. She's much smaller than me. She can get into tight spaces easier. She can do an extraction before anyone even realizes it's happening to them. She's very gentle about it. I can never finesse it so well. Linda's a real professional, very skilled.
Lucius's head was spinning. He had to get out of here, had to go and find Narcissa. She had to know who she was entertaining in her garden. They sat on the dock of the Malfoy Lake, watching the little kelpie as it frolicked and played in the water in front of them. Draco was true to his word. Kirby did take on the shape of a terrier, frolicking and cavorting across the surface of the water, occasionally diving down underneath as Draco tossed it a little ball. "So, this Triwizard Tournament, do you think you're going to put your name in for it?" Hermione asked guardedly,
She had studied up on it when it had been mentioned the week before at dinner. Students and judges had died in the past, and it did not seem like a wise endeavour. My father wants me to.
It seems really dangerous, Draco. I've read about the history of them. People have died, you know.
He turned to her, smirking. Are you worried about me, Hermione? I just want everyone to be safe, Pratt. Is there something wrong with that? She smirked back, leaning back on her elbows to enjoy the first rays of the sunset. Draco's expression fell. Oh. In that moment he looked so forlorn, and she felt a tug on her heart. But yes, I would be worried about you, specifically, if you were chosen. She sat up then, placing a hand over his as it rested on the surface of the dock. I do care about you, you know. His silver eyes looked into hers, bright, shining copper that caught the reflected evening sun, making them seem to almost glow. I care about you too. The words came automatically to Draco. I like you very much. She leaned in then, her eyes half-lidded as her body moved towards him. Their lips met gently at first. He raised a hand, cupping it against the side of her neck, and deepened the kiss. There was a tiny pop in the air behind them on the dock. The presence of Miss Granger and Master Draco is requested for dinner, said the adorable elf, who stood there. Oh! Hermione startled, smoothing down her skirt, even though it had not moved. Thanks, Pym, Draco said, although from his tone he didn't sound thankful at all. Hermione looked sideways at him, and could see the pink flush to his cheeks. She was certain her own looked the same. We'll be there in just a minute.
Do Master Draco and Miss Granger wish to come with Pym?
The small elf held out an arm, offering apparition. There was a hint of amusement in the old elf's eyes. No, we can walk, Draco grumbled. You can go now, thanks. The small elf popped away, and Hermione giggled uncontrollably in embarrassment. I'm pretty sure he was acting as my mother's spy, Draco groused. Treacherous little bugger. He's supposed to be my elf.
Well, what does that mean? Your elf? Isn't he a servant?
Yes, he's a servant. Why?
They stood, turning towards the manor house. Almost automatically, Draco reached for her hand, lacing his fingers in hers. The warmth of his hand travelled up her arm, sending a zip of electricity into the pit of her stomach. By servant, you mean he's staff, right? Does he live here? Draco's brow furrowed as though he had never considered the question.
Yes, of course. His magic is tied to the house, to our family.
Tied to? Do you mean bound? Can he leave?
I don't think so. Not unless we send him somewhere. It was Hermione's turn to knit her eyebrows together in consternation.
Is he paid?
Draco laughed uproariously. Salazar sack! I can't imagine the tantrum Pym would throw if I offered him money.
Hermione's footsteps slowed. Draco's hand in hers, which for a moment before had given her such a thrill of excitement, now felt a little like a lead weight. So your elves are tied to the house. They can't leave, and they don't make any money. And you dress them as beggars.
This last word was practically spat out in anger. Granger, if we gave them clothes, that would give them their freedom. They don't want that. They would be disgraced, shunned by their own kind. Her anger was reaching a boiling point now.
So, you have the ability to free them, and yet you won't? You would be so cruel?
It isn't cruelty. Elves, they love to serve. It's what they're born for. If we freed them, they'd have nowhere to go, nothing to do. It would be like saying that you and I were being forced to be witches or wizards. It's what we were born to do, and we enjoy it.
Up until a few years ago, I thought I was born to be a doctor. I didn't know any better. It wasn't until someone came and told me, enlightened me, that I was able to make my own path.
They had stopped now.
under an apple tree still several yards from the lanai of the manor.
"Hermione, I get that you're worried about the elves. I have to say I don't understand it, but I get it.
The thing is, they like what they're doing, and no amount of telling them anything different would change that." She pursed her lips together in anger. This discussion wasn't over, not by a long shot, but she could tell that the issue was much larger than just this one elf, this one wizard. They could table the conversation for now, but if she had anything to say about it, that elf and everyone like him would have his freedom one day.
After dinner that night, Richard and Linda were shown to the nicest guest room in the East Wing, a few rooms away from Hermione's. "What an odd night!" Richard groaned softly as he undressed, loosening his tie and hanging it carefully over the door of the wardrobe. "Lucius was acting even stranger than usual before dinner. Wanted to know about Hermione's adoption." Linda wrinkled her nose in confusion. "That is weird. I don't know what to make of it. Narcissa said he has his peculiarities, and to just ignore them." "How so?" "Oh, back in the day when they were young, she said that Lucius fancied himself a soldier of sorts. He wanted to serve, but wasn't really able to, so he enjoys hearing about it, I guess. And he is a little bit enamored with the idea of you being in the service. That's why he brings it up with you so much." Linda approached him and turned her back. "Unzip me, darling." Richard unzipped her dress, sliding it off her shoulders. She caught it as it fell down her arms. "It seems that he thinks you were some sort of special agent in the service," she said, turning her head and wiggling her eyebrows suggestively at him. "Ah, yes, well, that would make sense, then." He ran his hand along her bare shoulders. "Well, you know, I did provide support for some elite units. There were dangerous situations, Lindy Hop." She giggled. His breath tickled, and she could feel the wine at dinner making her relaxed. You're right. I do remember you telling me about patching up that poor sergeant after he got drunk and hopped into that cow pasture in Northern Ireland late one night. What was he doing? Trying to find terrorist cows?" Richard turned her to face him, kissing her neck. Yes. I told him he should steer clear, but he wouldn't listen." She giggled. "Hush! I don't think I will. Come on, get in bed. It's past your bedtime." She smiled sleepily, letting him lead her to the imposing four-poster bed in the center of the room. "Everything just goes in one ear and out the other with you, doesn't it?" She laughed lightly as she turned back the covers to get into the bed. "I am an utter disaster when it comes to you," Richard murmured, unbuttoning his shirt and hanging it carefully in the wardrobe. She laughed again as he came to sit on his side of the bed. "You do seem to have all the right moves," she said, with a little wink. He grinned back at her. "You're just trying to butter me up." She leaned towards him for a goodnight kiss. "Oh, I'm going to milk this for all that it's worth," she giggled. He groaned in laughter, rolling over to return the kiss. He smiled down at her in the low lamplight. His hand rubbed her shoulder. His wife was so beautiful, so perfect, and didn't even mind his horrible jokes. She was truly one of a kind. He gazed at her adoringly. She was phenomenal, and there were so many times in their lives that, when Richard really sat back and thought about what he had, he was astonished at his sheer luck in having found her and married her. He reached to the bedside table, blowing out the candle that sat upon it, then cuddled his wife close. As they lay together, nearly about to fall asleep, he whispered in her ear, "I'm not certain if I've told you this lately, my love, but you are legendary." She laughed softly. "Go to sleep, Special Agent Richard. We have a long day tomorrow."
"Come now, Lucius, it couldn't have been all that bad,"
Narcissa was rubbing lotion into her face and neck as they prepared for bed.
"You didn't hear him, Narcissa. He said hundreds. And you need to be careful around Linda. I think she's just as dangerous."
Narcissa only laughed quietly. Long after his wife had fallen asleep next to him, Lucius lay awake, replaying bits of his conversation with Richard. Finally, giving up on the idea of sleep, he crept back down the stairs to his study. Removing the pensieve from his cabinet, he sat at the desk, mulling over half-forgotten memories of a Christmas many years before. After a moment, he placed his wand point at his temple, withdrawing a strand of silver vapor that he deposited into the pensieve. He had been drunk that evening long ago. Narcissa had awoken the morning of their annual Yule party with pain in her abdomen. The pains often came at the start of a miscarriage. If that were to happen this time, it would be their third. Lucius longed for a son, a child to share his life with. He knew it would happen one day, but he had hoped that this would be the one. The fire whiskey took the edge off of all of that. The Yule party that year was mostly attended by Death Eaters and their wives and children. But Rodolphus and his brother Rabistan had not come. Narcissa had questioned Bellatrix about that. They were away on a mission, she'd said. Past Lucius had been carousing with Goyle and Knot, when present-day Lucius saw it. Bellatrix whispering in the Dark Lord's ear. The Dark Lord standing, gliding across the room behind her, her face stretched in a wide, maniacal grin. Just as they reached the door, Bellatrix turned, running a hand up the Dark Lord's chest, caressing his cheek. She gave him a suggestive look as she whispered something to him, and they disappeared through the door. 9 months later, the baby that would be soon known as Hermione Granger would be born. Lucius emerged from the pensieve, trying to think back as to whether he had ever seen Bellatrix pregnant. He could not be certain. 1979 had been a busy time for him as well. Narcissa had indeed miscarried a few days later, only to fall pregnant again in the middle of September. Missions from the Dark Lord had been fragmented but frequent. Lucius had mainly interacted with his own team of Knot, Goyle, and Travers. Bellatrix had not attended many meetings that year that he could recall. The Dark Lord seemed to become both more power-hungry and more paranoid as the days and months of 1979 and 1980 stretched on. Lucius did recall Bellatrix coming to visit soon after Draco was born, in June of 1980. He swiftly raised his wand again to his temple, withdrawing the memory.
"He's adorable, Sissy. I know you're proud," Bellatrix had said. "I know I would be, if I had had a son."
At these words, Bellatrix's mouth tightened, and her gaze moved to the window, taking in the lush, late-spring rose garden below. Past Lucius had been standing across the room, making conversation with Siobhan Flint. She had stopped by with her 4-year-old son, Marcus, to bring a baby gift. Past him had been focused on containing the annoying child, who seemed hell-bent on stomping on someone's feet before the day was done. But present-day him watched Bellatrix's expression carefully. She had not said, "If I were to have a son," or even, "if I had a son." She had said, "If I had had a son." Was she only speaking hypothetically, or was it a slip of the tongue? Was that sadness or regret on her face? Was she thinking of a child she would never carry, or of the child she had given up? He could not be sure, but he feared the worst. Was this, then, Richard Granger's ultimate mission? Had he and his professional assassin wife been chosen to raise the daughter of the Dark Lord? Thank you for listening to The Muggle Death Eater, and His Daughter by Great 78. If you enjoyed this and would like to listen to more, please subscribe to me on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts at Silver and Copper, or search Great 78 on Archive of Our Own.